The afternoon was hot in San Giovanni Rotondo, and a light breeze blew through the church square. Antonio, a 14-year-old boy, sat on his usual bench, very close to the Capuchin monastery. His bare feet were dusty, and his simple, worn clothes betrayed his humble origin. He didn't have his own home. He lived with his mother in a small rented room at the back of a bakery. Every day, after school, he would wait for his mother to finish selling bread and olive oil in the square while he did his homework. He loved to study. His dream was to learn to read the scriptures on his own, without needing to ask anyone for help. On the other side of the square, among the well-dressed ladies who strolled after Mass, Donna Vittoria looked at the boy with suspicion. She had never liked seeing him there. She murmured among her friends that this boy was not like the others, that he did not belong to the village. He's always here, sitting, watching, he's planning something, she whispered to the other women, who nodded with dubious looks. To her, poverty was synonymous with danger, and a boy alone, without a known father, could only mean trouble. And so, in her mind, a verdict had already been passed. That boy needed to be removed before something bad happened. Antonio didn't notice the looks of judgment. He was absorbed in his math problems, scribbling in the old notebook he had gotten from a priest at the church. To him, the square was just a place of waiting and learning. He liked the routine. The sound of the bells at dusk, the smell of fresh bread coming from his mother's stall, the murmur of prayers from the monastery, all of that made him feel a part of that place. But he did not know that. That day, something would change his life forever. Determined to act, Donna Vittoria sent for the village guards. 2 soldiers came at firm steps, dismounted from their horses, and walked directly toward Antonio. He only realized what was happening when he saw heavy boots stopping before him. His heart raced. He had never been approached by guards before. Before he could understand, one of them ordered him to stand up. The other was already pulling out his cloth bag, opening it and rifling through the little he had. The notebook fell to the ground, scattering its scribbled pages. "What are you doing here, boy? Show us what you have," demanded the soldier harshly. Antonio's heart pounded in his chest. His trembling hands tried to gather the notebook, but the guard prevented him. The curious gazes of the passers-by began to fix on him as if he were a criminal. "He's here every day watching people," said Donna Vittoria, approaching with an air of triumph. Some people agreed, others merely observed, not knowing how to react. The square, once tranquil, now turned into a silent tribunal where a defenseless boy was about to be condemned without having committed any crime. Antonio felt his face burning with shame. He didn't understand why he was being treated that way. He tried to say something, but his voice came out trembling and weak. The soldiers continued rummaging through his bag, shaking it as if they expected to find something incriminating. But all that was there were broken pencils, some loose sheets, and a small prayer book that he always carried. One of the guards held the little book between his calloused fingers and looked at it with disdain. "Is this what you hide?" he asked, raising the object so that everyone could see. The crowd began to murmur. Some ladies whispered that this was an exaggeration, but no one dared to intervene. The air grew heavy, laden with judgment. Donna Vittoria crossed her arms and said, with the certainty of someone who believes they are doing a service to the community, "Better safe than sorry. These boys grow up without direction, and then, when it's too late, no one understands what went wrong." Her words hit Antonio like a blow. He wanted to shout that he wasn't a delinquent, that he was just studying while waiting for his mother, but he felt a knot in his throat that prevented him from speaking. "Documents," ordered one of the guards. Antonio lowered his head. He didn't have any. He had never needed one. No one had ever asked him before. He tried to explain, "I was just waiting for my mother. She's over there selling bread." He pointed to the stall on the other side of the square, but no one even looked in the direction he indicated. "No documents," the guard repeated. "Then come with us." Antonio felt a shiver of fear. Where would they take him? What would happen to him? The boy looked around, searching for help in the faces of the people. No one moved. Some watched with curiosity, others averted their eyes. Only an elderly lady, who sold candles near the church, tried to intercede. "He's just a boy," she said softly, but her words were lost in the murmur of the crowd. The guards grabbed Antonio by the arm and began to pull him away. His heart raced. He couldn't let them take him. He couldn't let his mother worry, not knowing where he was. It was at that moment that an unexpected silence fell over the square. A familiar sound was heard, firm, slow, and determined footsteps. Someone was approaching. The guards hesitated, and the crowd instinctively parted, as if a greater presence were arriving. When Antonio looked up, he saw the figure of a friar in a worn brown cassock, his hands crossed in front of his chest, and a deep, serene look in his eyes. It was Padre Pio. The silence that took over the square was almost sacred. The guards let go of Antonio's arm and turned to the figure of the friar who was slowly approaching. Padre Pio, with his time-worn brown habit and simple sandals, stopped before the group and looked directly into the boy's eyes. His gaze was intense, but it carried no reproach, only deep compassion. Antonio felt a strange warmth in his chest, as if, for the first time that day, someone saw who he really was. The friar lifted his eyes to the guards and asked calmly, "What is happening here?" His voice was firm yet serene, carrying an authority that did not need effort to impose itself. One of the soldiers cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the presence of the priest, and tried to explain, "We received a report of suspicious behavior, Father. They said that this boy stays here every day, watching people." Padre Pio raised an eyebrow slightly. "And since when did waiting for one's own mother or studying become suspicious behavior?" The crowd held its breath. The silence was now one of embarrassment. The guard hesitated, trying to justify his actions, but words seemed to fail him. Donna Vittoria, who until then had remained firm in her accusation, crossed her arms and grumbled, "I only meant to warn of a possible problem." Padre Pio turned his gaze to her, and for a moment she felt a chill run down her spine. The friar didn't need to say anything. The weight of that look, full of steadfast yet penetrating love, made her feel a guilt she had never experienced before. Then, slowly, Padre Pio knelt down and picked up the prayer book that the guards had thrown on the ground. He ran his hand over the cover as if dusting it off and handed it back to Antonio. "Were you reading this?" he asked, his voice now gentler. Antonio, with a dry throat, simply nodded. The friar gave a small smile and gently touched the boy's shoulder. "Then you were doing something far more valuable than anyone here can imagine." The entire square seemed to wait for what would happen next. The soldiers, now visibly uncomfortable, exchanged quick glances, not knowing how to proceed. Donna Vittoria looked away, and some people in the crowd began to murmur, no longer against Antonio, but against the injustice they had just witnessed. Padre Pio stood up, crossed his hands over his chest, and in a tone that left no room for contestation said, "Release the boy. There is nothing wrong here. The only mistake was the hasty judgment." The guards did not dare to contest. They immediately released Antonio, but the boy remained still, as if he still couldn't believe he was free. His eyes, once full of fear, now reflected a mix of relief and confusion. He didn't understand why that friar, a man he barely knew, was defending him so firmly. Padre Pio, noticing his perplexity, rested his hand gently on the boy's head in a gesture that resembled a silent blessing. The crowd, once inclined to judge, now felt uncomfortable before the scene. The silence was broken by the friar's voice as he addressed not only the guards, but everyone witnessing the episode. "Do you know this boy?" he asked, letting his voice echo through the square. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged glances. "Do you know his story, his family, his struggles?" The answer was obvious. They knew nothing about Antonio, yet they had condemned him without hesitation. Then Padre Pio did something unexpected. He knelt before Antonio, coming to his level, and took the boy's small, trembling hands. "Tell me, my child, who are you?" he asked gently. The boy swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. No one had ever asked him that before. He quickly looked at his mother, who was still working without knowing what was happening, and then turned back to the priest. In a weak voice, he began to speak. He told how his father had never been present, that his mother did everything possible to support him, and that despite the hardships, he dreamed of studying and learning more about God. He explained how he liked being in the square because there he felt safe, listening to the church bells and watching the monks pass by. He wanted perhaps one day to learn to read the sacred texts on his own. As he spoke, his voice trembled, but there was sincerity in every word. Padre Pio listened to him with absolute attention, as if nothing else mattered in that moment. When the boy finished, a heavy silence fell over the square. For the first time, people truly saw him. Donna Vittoria, who had spoken so confidently before, now kept her eyes lowered, avoiding looking at the friar. Some ladies murmured remorsefully, and even the guards appeared disconcerted. Padre Pio then stood up, looked around, and said firmly, "Before judging, get to know. Before pointing fingers, love. For the true danger is not in the poor, but in a heart that closes itself to compassion." Padre Pio's words hovered over the square like a call to conscience. An awkward silence took hold of the place, and many lowered their heads, ashamed for having judged Antonio without even knowing him. Donna Vittoria, who had previously carried an air of superiority, seemed restless. She tried to justify herself, but her voice came out weakly. "I was only worried about everyone's safety." But the weight of Padre Pio's gaze made her doubt her own words. Deep down, she knew it wasn't concern, but prejudice. An old newsstand operator who had worked for years in the square selling candles and small saint cards decided to speak up. In his hoarse, trembling voice, he said, "I see this boy here every day. He has never hurt anyone. On the contrary, I have seen him helping his mother, picking up the fallen bread, sharing the little he has with other boys. We judged him without reason." The recognition of the truth began to spread through the crowd. Some people nodded, others cast repentant looks at Antonio. The guards, realizing they had acted hastily, lowered their weapons and stepped back. One of them cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable, and said, "There is no crime here. It was a mistake." But Padre Pio did not allow the matter to end with an empty apology. He looked directly at the soldiers and at everyone present. "The error is not only in accusing without evidence. The true error lies in a heart that shuts itself off and does not see Christ in the other. Today it was this boy. Tomorrow, who will it be?" Antonio, who had remained silent until then, felt something change inside him. For the first time he realized he was not alone. There were people who, albeit belatedly, had stood up for him. He looked at Padre Pio with tearful eyes, not knowing how to express his gratitude. But the friar only smiled and placed his hand on the boy's head, blessing him. "You do not need to thank me, but God, who never abandons those who are wronged." The episode did not end there. After that afternoon, the way the village looked at Antonio changed. Some shopkeepers began to offer help, others started greeting him in the square, and his mother received new work opportunities. The boy, once invisible to the community, became a symbol of transformation. What began as an act of prejudice was turned by God's grace into a call for compassion and justice. But the greatest change was not in the village, it was in Antonio's heart, which never again doubted that God saw him and cared for him. Antonio's story spread quickly throughout San Giovanni Rotondo. What had once been merely an incident of injustice became a topic echoing through the streets and alleys of the village. People began to reflect on their own hasty judgments, on how they had been carried away by fear and indifference. Some ladies who once avoided the boy now made a point of greeting him when passing through the square. Even Donna Vittoria, still ashamed by what had happened, set aside her disapproving glances and began to treat Antonio with cautious respect. But the most significant change came from the church itself. Inspired by Padre Pio's attitude, some of the faithful began to mobilize to help children like Antonio. A village teacher, moved by the episode, offered to give free classes to him and other boys who did not have access to adequate study materials. A shopkeeper, who had previously ignored the boy's presence, began to leave an extra loaf of bread for him and his mother every day. The small bench where Antonio used to sit to study came to be seen differently, not as a nuisance, but as a symbol of perseverance. Padre Pio, however, did not stop at that moment of justice. He saw beyond the episode. He understood that true transformation happened in people's hearts. Therefore, he began to speak more frequently in his homilies about the importance of seeing Christ in one's neighbor, especially in the poor, the rejected, the little ones. His sermons grew in strength, and more people began to attend the church with the sincere desire to change the way they lived their faith. For Antonio, all of this was a mystery. He had never expected that a simple misunderstanding could change so many things. He still went to the square every day, but now his presence no longer generated suspicious looks. On the contrary, some residents even stopped to ask about his studies, to encourage him. He continued to help his mother with the sale of bread and olive oil, but now he felt that he was not just an invisible boy. He was part of that community, finally belonging to that place. In time, what happened that day in the square became a story, remembered by many, a living testimony to the power of compassion and the danger of hasty judgment. The bench where it all happened, once just an ordinary seat, became a silent symbol of the miracle of transformation, not only in Antonio's life, but in the entire village. Despite the visible changes in the village, there were still those who, in silence, carried the same prejudices as before. Some would not admit their mistake, preferring to believe that the whole situation was just a misunderstanding. Others, even without words, continued to avoid Antonio, as if they could not accept that a poor boy could occupy a space of dignity within the community. The human heart, Padre Pio well knew, was slow to completely transform. It was then that, at a Sunday Mass, the friar decided to address the topic openly. The church was full as usual, and the murmur of voices fell silent as he stepped up to the pulpit. His gaze swept over the familiar faces of the village, men, women, children, many of whom had been in the square that day. With a calm yet piercing voice he began, "How many times do we judge without knowing? How many times do we deny the bread, the word, the merciful glance to our brother because he seems different to us? How many times do we forget that Christ walked among the poor and the rejected?" Padre Pio's words cut through the silence like a blade. Some of the faithful lowered their eyes, others seemed restless. Antonio, seated at the back of the church, felt a tightening in his chest. The friar continued, "If we truly want to live the faith, it is not enough to pray. It is not enough to come to church and hear the scriptures. We must see Christ in the other. We must love in practice, open our hearts to those who need it most. What good are our prayers if our heart remains closed?" The homily was a call to conversion, but also a warning. It was not only about Antonio. It was about every poor person, every needy soul that passed unnoticed, every hasty judgment that condemned without mercy. Gradually, an atmosphere of reflection took over the temple. There was something different about that Mass. Some people began to cry quietly, as if those words had touched something deep within them. It was as if a veil was being lifted, revealing just how much they still needed to grow in faith. At the end of the service, something unexpected happened. Donna Vittoria, the woman who had denounced Antonio, approached him. Her face was marked by a mixture of wounded pride and genuine remorse. With a heavy sigh, she extended her hand and said, almost in a whisper, "Forgive me, boy." Antonio was speechless for a moment, but then slowly nodded, accepting that apology. Padre Pio, watching from afar, smiled discreetly. True faith was shown not only in visible miracles, but in the small transformations of the heart. The days passed, and something in the village of San Giovanni Rotondo changed definitively. Antonio's story was not forgotten as just another incident of the past. Instead, it became a symbol of what it truly means to live the gospel. The bench where the boy used to sit gained a new meaning for the residents. Once seen as a place of suspicion, it became a space of welcome, where children gathered to study, play, and learn. What began as an act of injustice was transformed by God's grace into a seed of compassion and solidarity. Antonio, for his part, was never treated as a stranger again. Some people, touched by the episode, began to help him and his mother discreetly. A shopkeeper offered her a better space to sell her bread and olive oil, ensuring her more dignity and security. The village teacher committed herself to helping him with his studies, and Padre Pio himself ensured that he would have everything he needed to continue learning. The boy, once rejected, now felt that he was part of that community, not just as someone tolerated, but as someone loved and valued. The church square also came to have a new meaning. Inspired by Padre Pio's words, some people began to organize weekly meetings to help those in need. Gatherings were held to collect clothes, food, and support for families who had previously been ignored. What was once a place of judgment and indifference became a space of sharing and love for one's neighbor. Time went by, and life continued its course. But one thing remained. The presence of Padre Pio continued to echo in the village, not only in words, but in concrete actions. He had taught everyone that true miracles happen when hearts open to mercy. And that episode with Antonio was a reminder that God acts in the most unexpected moments, using ordinary people to bring about great changes. To this day, no one can fully explain the force with which that simple intervention transformed an entire village. Was it merely the presence of a holy man? Was it a silent miracle without visible signs, but with a profound impact? Whatever it was, no one who was there that day emerged unscathed. Faith had been strengthened, eyes had been opened, and an entire community had been transformed. And in Antonio's heart, one certainty remained. God had never abandoned him, and would never abandon him. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs this message of faith. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of miracles and overcoming adversity. Join our community to strengthen your faith and be inspired by real-life testimonies.